I'm writing the story on how India discovers the heritage of the Second World War. And his story, his book is...
I welcome you all to the Manipur book launch of Raghu Karnad's much acclaimed. Thankful to you for gracing this occasion. The historical legacy woven around this tragic event can be a catapult for greater understanding and harmony between nations and their people through people-to-people contact for peace and development in the region. The war sites of Manipur in this direction offer unique opportunities to tourists from these countries as well as from India who can revisit history and pay homage to their near and dear ones who laid down their lives in this great war. The recreational travel combined with historical studies and the diversified facets of Manipur's unique flora and fauna and culture art offers Manipur as a great tourist destination. We are indeed grateful to Raghu for bringing the spotlight back to the harrowing impact of the war, no matter from which side one fought, and the impassionate and impartial study of history to understand the marginalized and subaltern sections' contribution to it, which has not been highlighted so far. Many books have been written on the World War II, but no book has unleashed the truthful account of the monumental role of India in it. In its fascinating and thrilling prose, through the emotional and turbulent story of three young men, Bobby, Gyani, and Manik, Raghu has been immensely thorough in his work to put a right perspective the extraordinary role played by India and its soldiers in this great battle. I express my sincere gratitude to Raghu Karnad for accepting our invitation to have the Manipur launch of this book at such a short notice. I'm also thankful to Dr. R.K. Nimai, who is here and who will be doing the honors of the launching of the book. He has been a constant support and a source of guidance for all of us. I'd also like to welcome Emma Horn and express my sincere thanks for sharing her experiences in promotion of war tourism. I'll be failing in my duty if I don't welcome Mr. Shashak, a war veteran from Ukhrul, who has joined us, who has been very, very kind to join us here. And I welcome him, and we are very keen to hear from him his experiences also. And last but not the least, I would also thank Emasi Foundation and Mr. Somi Roy, who has been instrumental in organizing this event. So thank you very much, everyone.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rajeshwar, and today I will be presenting a small PowerPoint presentation on the Battle of Imphal. I think this is quite relevant with the book, the Farthest, Raghu Karnad's book, because the protagonist of the book revolves around the Battle of Imphal, and he participated in this Battle of Imphal, and his grave is also lie today in the Imphal War Cemetery. In 1942, the Japanese army had driven the British, Indian and Chinese troops out of Burma. There were British garrisons or Allied garrisons, troops in Imphal as well as Kohima before 1944, just after 42. The United States Army created air bases in Assam from which supplies were flown to the nationalist Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek. Reason for Japanese invasion or the Operation Yugo, why the Japanese came over Imphal, and there was war between the Allied and the Japanese. There were three main reasons. It was first to disrupt the air supply of Chiang Kai-shek's government by Americans from air bases in Assam. And Japan was getting defeat after defeat in Pacific region. So they need a single victory to show the people of Japan. And the third factor is the Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA. Thank you.
I'll ask Mr. Raghu Karnad to present his book, Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. It's such a privilege to be back here in Imphal, where this whole story begins for me. Foundation, and it's the State Tourism Department of Manipur. Thank you so much. It's a real privilege, and it means a great deal to me. And thank you all for coming here. Now, before I begin to read from the book, I just want to make a short personal introduction to the book and how I first encountered the story of the Second World War and India's war. I should start with a caveat, which is that I'm not a historian. I wasn't even an amateur historian until 3 years ago, which is when I first learned about the existence of a young man in my family. He was my grandmother's brother, whose name was Bobby Mugaseth. Now, I'd only ever known of Bobby as a photograph in my grandmother's house. He had begun to fade from my family's memory, and after my grandmother's death, and as that generation passed away and passed on, he'd reached that point where he was about to cease to exist in memory at all. But what I learned about him that day made me need to recover as much as I could about Bobby, because what I learned was that he had joined the British Indian Army in 1942, at the height of the Indian freedom struggle, and also the height of the Second World War in Asia. Now, I'm a journalist. I thought I knew a lot about Indian history. I thought I knew a fair amount about the Second World War. And yet it had never occurred to me to spend much time thinking about how those two overlapped. And it certainly never occurred to me that I might find a family story in that overlap. And when I followed it, I discovered that it wasn't just Bobby, but it was both his brothers-in-law. In fact, it was all the young men of that generation in my family who had gone off to fight for the British Empire, while their countrymen were fighting to be free of it. And they hadn't all come back, and I had no idea why. But now I had to find out. So that was the beginning of this private quest, which started here in Imphal, at a gravesite in the Imphal War Cemetery, which was the first place that I saw Bobby's name actually written out on his epitaph. And a journey began for me there through Manipur, along the war front, all the way between Churchandpur, through Moirang, through Laimaton, and all of the places that Rajeshwar mentioned, through Imphal and Ukhrul and Jasami, and all the way to Kohima, where I discovered the scale of the Second World War here. And a separate journey began there as well, which was the journey of tracking down Bobby's life. I began at the end in Imphal and traced it backwards, all the way back to the pier on the Calicut seafront in Kerala. And en route, it took me to many different parts. I didn't get to visit them all, but it went through many different parts of the country and many different places in the world. Places that I would never have dreamt of associating with the Second World War. Places like Peshawar, Madras, Iraq, and Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and Sudan, and Java. Places that don't belong in the popular histories of World War II, but it turns out were gripped by the war and were deeply transformed by them. And those were the sites of events, huge events on such a scale that they can really only be compared to the scale of the hole into which all of that disappeared once the war was over and vanished from our national history and from our shared awareness. No one seemed to remember that any of it had even happened. But I was lucky. I was lucky in two ways. I was lucky because the personal stories of this family, who were my family, of these young men, tracked very well with the larger story of the Indian Army and of India's engagement in the war. So through their eyes, I found I could see a lot of this hidden landscape of India's Second World War. And I was also lucky because I'd come to this story very late. Too late to ask my grandmother what had happened, much too late to ask Bobby himself, but not yet too late to meet some members of that generation who are still with us. and to ask them. So I met some civilians who could tell me about the family, and I met veterans who could tell me about the war and who could share their insights and answer my questions and help me write this book. This particular launch here is especially meaningful to me because one of the members of that generation is here with us this evening. Someone who lit the spark of the business of remembering the war in my mind. It's Mr. Yangmasho Shishak, who is here from Sangshak. Can you please give him a hand? He's long before people like me were interested in it. Yes. Long before people like me even knew about it, long before even people like Rajeshwar grew interested, Mr. Shishak was a trustee of the memory and of the knowledge of the war in the Manipur hills. And I think that's an invaluable contribution. So, this year is the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. It may not seem like a very important, like a very significant anniversary. Last year was a significant anniversary of a different event. It was the centenary of the start of the First World War, which started in 1914. Well, I was, so that was very important. It was commemorated in many different parts of the world, and with great with great emotion and with great ceremony. And I was in London meeting my publishers at the time, at the peak of the centenary observances in 2014. And they were very glorious. There were 2 towers of light, 2 columns of light that lit up above London. In the Tower of London, there were these poppies, one for every man who had fallen in the war, that spilled out of the tower. And I was very moved. But I was also quite puzzled, because to observe a centenary of an event makes mathematical sense. It's 100 years. But a centenary is also a way to almost guarantee that anyone who was young, anyone who was alive and lived through that event, is now gone. If they were young and sentient in 1914, they are all gone, and it's too late in 2014 to learn anything new from them or to ask them anything. And in that light, the 70th anniversary has a different significance, a more human significance, because it's a reminder that that generation is still with us. And right now is the time to learn what we can from them about the history that we might not know. And what's at stake when it comes to the Second World War is not just historical information. What's at stake is a huge part of our legacy as Indians, an even huger part of your legacy as Manipuris. Because the war, the war transformed India in many ways, and India affected the war in many ways. But for most of India, it was indirect. The war never actually landed and was never actually fought on Indian soil outside of this part and outside of Andaman and Nicobar and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But in Manipur, the war came and swept practically across the entire state. So almost anyone who belongs to that generation, for them, their earliest memories, the memories of their childhood, the oldest people in the society here are people for whom their first memories are of the Second World War. And there's an amazing amount that we can still learn from them, as I have only begun to do. So it's a part of our national legacy and the legacy of our communities. It's a story, it's a saga that is as great as anything that Indians have ever participated in. And it's a crucial piece of the story of how the Indian Army came to be and how India itself reached freedom.
I request a volunteer to come back. And request Raghu to take center stage so that everybody can get to see the book and you.
Gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure for me. As far as I could remember, I have seen only one book on the Second World War written by an Indian author, which is about some 20 or 25 years back. It is on the 14th Army, written by a brigadier. Most of the books on the Second World War, particularly of the Battle of Imphal and Kohima, were written by from the British side. History is basically the version of the victors, not of the vanquished. But not all participants in the victory are able to write their own version. Raghu Karnad's book, even though it's a very personal story, covers the entire gamut of the rise of the Indian Army. Because the Indian Army during the Second War have changed the outlook totally. Earlier, only what is known as the martial races were recruited in the Indian Army. But during the Second World War, from different communities, so the Indian were recruited. So Indian Army became a part of what is known as the mini India. From Mahars, from the Dogras. Dogras are particularly martial races, but from the civil caste, from the Harijans, people have joined the Indian Army. And during the Second World War, the outlook of the Indian Army also changes. The British Indian Army were earlier not very well equipped, but when they have to face the Japanese, they have to be not Bob or Robert. In fact, his name when he was recruited in the army was R. Kathing. R stands for his surname, Daling. But the British found it so difficult to pronounce, so they converted as Robert and called him Bob. So now his name, Kathing, has become his surname. All his sons, like Somi Kathing, then Darlindo Kathing, is adopting the name Kathing as a surname. So these are funny snippets which happen during when the culture, different cultures come into play in one area. My uncle also joined during the Second World War in the Second Assam. Assam Regiment was raised only in 1941 to meet the onslaught of the Japanese. And here, Manipuris, Mizos, Lothars, Angamis, Assamese, every community from the Northeast India was recruited. My uncle was in the Second Assam, which saw battle in Jasami, the Battle of Kohima, and again in the Battle of Imphal. And it is going to celebrate the 75th anniversary next year, sometime in May, June. So this Second World War has brought tremendous changes in this region. What I like about Raghu's book is basically we are not aware, people who have been in Manipur were never aware that there was large scale of what Rajeshwar mentioned, Lanchenpa, where people ran away from the city to stay in because of an impending invasion. We never thought that Madras was also having this effect. But after reading Raghu's book, I come to realize that, okay, it is not only in Manipur that the impact of the Second World War was there and people were running away from the cities and all. So we learn, in fact, I learned more about the history from such non-fiction than actual history written by the historians, because it is, say, if you look into the Battle of Imphal or in the Battle of Sangshak, written by a well-known historian, it is very dry, cut and dry. There is what we call no desire to complete the book in one sitting. Raghu's book I literally completed in one sitting because it was so. It is like reading a racy thriller novel. So it is as good as that. And I would request all the audience and those who are here to at least go through the book once. Then you will understand the big event this the Second World War had on the Indian psyche. Unfortunately, in India, the contribution of the British Indian Army in the Second World War is literally, we are trying to forget it. I think we are giving more emphasis on the Indian National Army, the INA. So I was talking to Raghu the other day that in Manipur also, one of the last person to receive the Tamra Patra, which is the award given to the veteran freedom fighter, is Captain Naki. He was a real INA, but he was one of the last. Many bogus people have claimed, and the real heroes were the last to receive, because politics have started, politics have entered into, then I don't like his face, I like his face. So this thing happened. But the Indian Army has to come out with this selective amnesia about the contribution of the British Indian Army in the Second World War, whether it is in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Syria. Because our people have fought, many have sacrificed their lives. The British Army have still recognized, but our own Indian Army after independence have gone into a selective amnesia and trying to forget. Fortunately for the Assam Regiment, for the next year's celebration, they are inviting almost all the personnel's family members and all to participate in this, to remember the contribution made by their near and dear ones during the Second World War. And such efforts should have been there so that the contribution of the British Indian Army in the Second World War stays in our memory, and we acknowledge the contribution made by them. One thing I learned about the Second World War is that it advances the independence of many countries in South and Southeast Asia. So India also got independence very quickly in 47 without taking up arms, but many countries have fought their independence with arms, and most of the arms are left behind during the Second World War. If the war was not fought, then these people would have fought against rifles with bows and arrows, and they would have delayed their independence by, if not decades, but 1 or 2 decades. Unfortunately, British Indian Army is seen more as a mercenary force in Southeast Asia, whether it is in the this Opium War, whether it is in the Dutch occupied territory. After the Second World War, the British Indian Army defended this territory against the local populace till the Dutch arrives. So this policy of the British Indian Army to hand over to the earlier colonists was a major mistake for the British policy. Many of the Southeast Asian countries to have certain reservation about India. Till now, India could not find a very good relation with either with Burma or with Cambodia or with Laos or Malaysia because of these incidents. I hope that people in Manipur will read this book and will appreciate the contribution made by Raghu in bringing out the contribution of the British Indian Army in the Second World War, particularly in Manipur, even though his chapter on Manipur is very, very small, because since it is his is a personal journey, only his personal, where it touches, it is there. One thing I have seen in almost all the books is the pronunciation of the places where, say, Rajeshwar say Nuksigam, but actually it is Nuksingam. Nuksi means love, Gam means victory. So it is a place where love conquers. It is like Omnia Vincit, so it is a place where love conquers. So our local pronunciation is missing. As a result, the meaning of the place is also gone. With these few words, I would like to thank the state government and the Department of Tourism and the Imasi Foundation for organizing this event, and I hope that this book will receive a much greater response from the people of Manipur and the entire Northeast. Thank you very much.
And has spent many years in New Delhi as a specialist in custom design travel in South Asia. Ms. Horn has been coming for the past few years to visit Nagaland, where she has designed tours specializing in the Battle of Kohima. Please welcome Emma Horn. That was a great round of applause. We request you to take your seat, sir. The discussion will be moderated by L. Somi Roy, founder and managing trustee of Imasi.
Like I'm armed with my own microphone. Thank you all. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Yambung, today. And thank you, Grace, for to help us tell, to help us to see. Yambung was saying so many eloquence is going to be its limitation. But one of the things that I do want to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, I think that since we have a very special event today, I'm sure there's a lot of things that you have not put in, but the amount of research, amount of time you must have spent, and the breadth and width of what you have done is that's a bedrock of this very thrilling story they're told, is something that I would like you to share with
the national history. One is that there are advantages to writing about a forgotten chapter. If I attempted to write up the Second World War history of a different country, of a more, of another major participant, say Britain or France or the USSR or China, I would have had to read through libraries after libraries before I was equipped to even make a comment. But as Dr. Nimai said, there is actually very little about India's role to start off with. So since I'm not a historian, it was to my advantage that the amount that the bibliography, the complete bibliography available about India's Second World War is not that extensive. So I spent about a year doing this research, and I think that I can say with some confidence that apart from the 8-volume Indian Army official history of the Second World War, I've read almost every other part of the canon of academic research on India's World War II. So there are advantages to finding a subject that is unexposed and being among the first people to visit it. The second thing is that the fact that something is forgotten doesn't necessarily mean it is erased. And especially when it comes to India's Second World War, it's vanished, I think, largely from the public consciousness or the common awareness of the civilian population. But the records are there abundantly. They still remain. They haven't disappeared. Unfortunately, they're better maintained in the UK than they are in India. But even here in India, for instance, the Ministry of Defense has a library that it calls the History Department, where all of the individual, the unit diaries of every unit that fought in the Second World War, therefore detailing what each unit did every single day, is available. And because this was the British Indian Army, and therefore not a war that we think was fought by the Indian government, I actually had access to that. I needed that. It was absolutely essential for me to tell a detailed story about what these guys and what their units were doing. Had I asked for details about a war just 3 years later, which was the war that Free India fought against Pakistan, there's no chance that I would have gotten that. So there's an advantage to that aspect of forgetting as well. As for the personal story, that research was in fact the hardest part, because it's not written down anywhere, or else it's written down in fragments, just as it is remembered in fragments. And And for this, I have to actually credit someone who you don't usually see accredited in academic publications. This is my mother. I spent most of my life not paying attention to all the relatives and all the family members who, I was supposed to go and visit. But suddenly, all of those elderly relatives and family members were very important to me. I needed to see them as soon as I could and ask them what they could tell me about these young people. And suddenly I remembered, I realized what the value is and what the importance is of the people who do the work of remembering and keeping families and older people in touch.
Would you like to add a word about perhaps
Absolutely.
And your research?
In terms of what goes into the book. So I did many interviews with anyone who I could find who had served in the Second World War. I traveled to various parts of the country to meet them and to talk to them. And those interviews were always fascinating. I mean, these were people telling terrific stories about seeing Mussolini strung up from a gas station after the Italian surrender in Italy, or flying nearly crashing a plane in Sumatra because a young pilot had overloaded it with whiskey which he was flying in for his friends. Things like this, great stories. But these meetings were also very poignant because given this project, what I was doing was I was meeting men who were in the very late hours of their lives. They were all had an average age of about 92, and many were obviously infirm. Many of them had wives who might be bedridden, might be in the next room and ill, and they were all contemplating being at the end of their lives. And I was asking them to remember those periods of their lives when they were in the prime of health, when they were just out of college, in their early 20s, the world was at war, it was terribly exciting, they were healthy and fit and ready for adventure and sometimes in love. And so to look back on that from the present in which you are, when you're at the end of your life, could be a very emotional thing, and it was very touching. I should add about Manipur. Wow, so it all started for me in Manipur because Manipur was where I came and realized that India's war is not just an indirect sort of vague experience, that it's an extremely direct experience, and nowhere is it more direct than it is here in every part of Manipur, really. And as I said earlier, if you're the oldest people who are alive, who are part of our families and society here in Manipur, are people who all remember the war themselves. And I wasn't, in my first visit, I didn't meet any veterans per se, because there wasn't a great deal of recruitment from Manipur. But everyone else who's above a certain age experienced the war anyway, because the war came to them. The two of the greatest armies on the planet came smashing together above the very quiet hills and villages of Manipur. And people had wonderful stories. They talked about how they heard a buzzing, the village heard a buzzing one day, and it grew louder and louder, and they thought it was bees. But they were mystified because they couldn't see anything. And what it was the first airplanes passing over. And for many of them, the war it's really difficult to overestimate how important the war is to Manipur, because in a way that it wasn't to many other places, the war brought modernity to Manipur like an axe, unfortunately. It brought modernity very violently down on a place where, in the tribal hill areas, for instance, it had often been very difficult to procure metal. Now metal was raining down from the sky, and it was lethal. It was shooting through the forest, as Rajeshwar said. That metal is still killing people today. I think that someone should study what the psychic effect of encountering like industrial modernity through a war when you were living essentially a very ancient rural lifestyle must have been on the people here.
This is perhaps the first read. How did you meet him?
Mashe Shamshakta second word the Yam the Paurava Lepangni aduga mapamni haina mana my interest in the Shangshak the Lal Ipan Muna Kangna Krabani.
He said he met him at Shangshak, one of the battle sites that was mentioned in Rajeshwar Yumnam's presentation as well. I'm asking him to tell a few stories about how he was involved in the war.
Angang winning it up. Equay Shangshak, Aduga all Manipur school she Kavaya, Japan Pom Tagna in 80. I quake Maratha, 4 Maratha Galipatu regiment that peon.
He was a peon with the Maratha, and they said in Shangshak village they closed all the schools down because of the war.
Webematam Atuda Aina Hochik Second World War Sikrinu Kante Dunkaina naked. They Dunka Christian singer, a motion celebration, a young one labor Matamni.
It was a very hard time. I had no idea what the World War II was about.
During those days, half of his village are Christian and half are enemies.
I don't know.
Only the.
I don't know. How she Anna hiding it and the queen hiding it that I am my yet. Yam the Anna and she's the labor she go for coming in. Yam the people lipash the first word of shoe. Yam the Kotong Tiba Chakani. I do a Miam Shiduna. Welcome to the Naidiva. I'm not the shoe Laktava Yam, Low Yori Yam, no idea. First walking nation. I don't quite give Mr. Marie Shule later at the Yam, they quite many poor shit. Yam one, Pita to lay. Anishwana, Hochi, Second World War, Ashe, a quite away in the complainatico. I do complainati have about 30. Yam pick up Manipur Shida, a quay Imalipa Kangba Haina, a quay India among the Equina. Yang Karikum the labor she a yam nungite. I do the quite a young lega. I do Mataka Mushidaba Amuka Lapashina, a young one how she should Shiba Matawa a shining tray. Mashi short
He's saying he comes with a heavy heart today. First, because during those peaceful times we were invaded by all the violence of the World War, and he said in this particular episode that we are living now, there's so much of turmoil and violence that even if it has come for him to breathe his last, he would still like to live on to see the restoration of peace among us again.
Matugi Matumda quite active over behavior army over the 4 Marathaga Kalipatu Ashina company. Mamali Pang the Kanbado Shina Yam the Queen Takatik Takat Katavani.
Yeah, he says he has very high regards for these two this thing that he has just mentioned.
Anna of Jake 21 years now, me matik channel, check the Yokro Matamda, Iman Ebu Haya, no Creek Kapano Haya, yo, 80 Marathagi, Kalipa Turkey, Atuga Equa Maharaja Atukanda Equa Puropanta Hana, Puropata, Maharaja. Mana Ebu Chintuna, Kampor cum the Ebu Tajatuna, Echalieva. Adu sharp Mashi Kirikino Mashi E Pata de Manipugi lunch with a dear. Atupa Migi, Kanoda she Yate Heaven.
He's also talking about his conversation with his wife, and he says that during those days he was confused. He was in school, but because the school was closed, he became a peon in those days. And he said the Maharaja had instructed him to assist these people, but he was confused because that was